this is a really important story to tell, and to understand this is particularly now, because, as I was saying before, race is central to our story. Race, race, race. And a lot of people don't like that. And a lot of people don't want to hear about it.
Okay, we're live with another episode of The End Game with my co-host Herman Bowles, and we're going to talk about another monumental chapter in the college football integration. And it was Eddie McShann of Georgia Tech arriving there in 1969, recruited by Bud Carson, and becoming a sophomore starting quarterback in the 1970 season. And along with him was a another pioneering black player at Georgia Tech, Joe Harris, who went on and had an NFL career. And Joe's teammate at E.E. Smith, a storied high school in Fayetteville, North Carolina, was Charlie Baggett. We're all here together to talk about another monumental day in college football integration history. And I always count on Herman for your wisdom. Herman, how you doing?
I'm doing great. It's great to be here again with you, Tom, as always. And Charlie, welcome again. Great to see you. And I still think of those great high school memories that you have and all those great teammates. I mean, you guys should have been national champions with the talent that you had there at East Smith High School. And Joe, great to meet you. Certainly, as I say every time I meet one of you legends, you guys are the shoulders that certainly I stood on because I'm from Alabama, and same area that Condridge Holloway. Matter of fact, I played against Condridge Holloway in high school. He was a senior when I was a sophomore. He was quarterback, and I eventually became the first starting black quarterback at my high school. So you guys were at that next level. And just as perhaps we look up to our, heroes now, people like me were looking up to you guys because you were doing something in an era that we didn't know any better in terms of the segregation because I started high school at desegregated high school. However, what you guys did and how you performed, those of us who followed you, an idea that we could be something as well. So,
Okay. Well,
thank each of you for what you're doing. And I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Okay. Well, one thing that isn't understood about college football integration is it. Too many people think it started with the 1970 USC Alabama game, and the reason for that is a bunch of USC backers were unaware of all the progress that was taking place in the 1960s at places like Georgia Tech and Wake Forest and Auburn and Tennessee and Kentucky. And they were just completely unaware of it because the sports media avoided race. And that dates back to Jackie Robinson. If you go back and read the newspaper reports of Jackie Robinson's debut season, they didn't even mention that he was black until later in the stories. Basically, the reason I've heard for that is the white sports media didn't know how to handle it and just kind of avoided it. And they also didn't want to alienate subscribers and readers. But what happened on that very same day that USC played at Alabama? Stanford, with an all minority backfield, won at number 4 ranked Arkansas. It was the ABC TV National Game of the Week. And a guy named Hillary Shockley, a black fullback, playing the role that Sam Cunningham gets the credit for, had 3 touchdowns and 149 yards total offense. Nobody hears about that game. That was a bigger game than USC and Alabama. And also on that same day, Eddie McShann was the Deep South's first black starting quarterback. South Carolina was ranked number 17. They came to Grant Field in Atlanta, and Georgia Tech won. I think the score was 23-17. That's correct. And so a monumental day. And I want to start out with both Charlie, who's gotten to know Eddie while Charlie's been living down there in Atlanta for several years, and then Joe Harris, Charlie's teammate at Georgia Tech, to talk about the significance of what Eddie accomplished that day. Charlie, you go first.
Well, I first met Eddie through really Joe Harris, because Joe and I came out of high school together. In fact, Joe and I were childhood friends from kindergarten. So we go way back, and we were in the same class in kindergarten. We were the same class in elementary, junior high, and high school. And so we came up together, and we both were high school All-Americans back at that time. And we were being recruited by the same schools. And we sort of had a pact that we were going to go to the same school, but it didn't turn out that way for reasons. One, that Joe didn't want to stay in state, and the other one was that I was trying to break a barrier, and I wanted to go to North Carolina and see if they would play a black quarterback, and of course I signed there, and they didn't, and I left after 1 year and went to Michigan State. But Joe ended up going to Georgia Tech, which turned out great for him, and we've been friends ever since. And then our first recruiting visit was the first plane flight that Joe and I had ever taken, and we flew out of Grandis Field in Fayetteville, North Carolina, on a plane, and one of our other friends from Southern Pines, North Carolina, Charles Waddell, who ended up being a great player at North Carolina, ended up being my roommate. He was on the flight with us, and he was on the trip with us down to Georgia Tech, and that was my first meeting with Eddie McShann, who hosted both Joe and I. And there was another guy at Georgia Tech at the time, was a running back, Joe, Greg Holmes. And Greg and Eddie were the only two blacks on the team at that particular time at Georgia Tech. And Bud Carson was the coach, and they recruited Joe and I hard. Joe ended up coming to Georgia Tech in Atlanta, and having a great career, and moving on and having a great pro career, and in several halls of fame. He's in the Georgia Tech Hall of Fame, and Joe's in the Fayetteville Sports Hall of Fame. And so had an outstanding career. I ended up going to Michigan State and sitting out my first year there, because you couldn't play as a transfer at that particular time. Now you can go anywhere at any time and play. And so it's a little bit different than it was back then. But I set out that year that Joe ended up starting at Georgia Tech as a sophomore, and Eddie was the quarterback.
Joe, you were a pioneer on your own, but talk about the ground that Eddie was breaking as a quarterback, and then how you were in lockstep with him.
Eddie was, one of only one person, and he was special. It was even the way he dressed. He had everything coordinated. When I first met Eddie, we were on that recruiting trip, Charlie and I, and he loved to dress, so he had all different types of his glasses matched his watch and his ring. So I thought he had a lot of class, and it was also awful special to see a black quarterback coming in with leadership ability, had a lot of ability. He could throw with both hands, and being ambidextrous was a different too, to see a player that can take the ball from one hand, go to the other. Also, I would always say we had conversations about, what we do to help other players that will try to come to Georgia Tech. We were going to be honest about the academic side of the school. It's also a difficult side. You have to have two jobs. I always say you have a job in the classroom, you got a job on the football field. And one thing I knew Eddie had, he would share all the information that we had with classes and what professors we should take. And so we would take what we learned and share it with the young guys. Some guys that would come and they would want to know where we're going to party at. I said, I'll point right up there. You see that library? That's where I party. I sleep up there. Having Eddie in that position just gave us really high self-esteem, knowing you are that leader, everybody's watching you, and you got to make the right call, you got to make the right plays, because that's going to make this team work.
Okay. Yeah, Herman, you've talked about how important it was that Gary Steele recruited you to West Point. Talk about groundbreakers and what it means to the next rounds of players committing to a school.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. You call it the Underground Railroad to Michigan State, and there's no doubt it starts with someone having to be that pioneer, right? Having to be the code breaker, so to speak. And for me, being a country kid from Alabama, it was certainly something I wanted to do. And obviously, back when I was in junior high school and high school, it was Joe Namath, right? Number 12. I actually wore his number, was able to get his number, but that was the exciting thing to do. However, as and I don't know about you guys, my high school was integrated, so it wasn't like I was not around in an integrated environment. However, we were just kids out playing a game that we loved, and I'm certain that was the same thing for you guys. And then looking at that next opportunity, you certainly, I mean, I had the little kids in the neighborhood looking up to me after the game. They wanted your chin strap and all of that, much smaller scale than on the college scale. However, the emotions are the same. You're thinking of yourself as a role model. And I really like what you talk about, Joe, in terms of the leadership, because much of the leadership I think that I demonstrated in the Army, that I demonstrated in business today, came from what? Those fourth quarter drills, right? Fourth quarter, you got to suck it up, you got to go, and it's nothing that you can do by yourself. You got to depend on a teammate to get things done as well. So the opportunity, as I said in the opening, to look up to the great things that you guys were doing in collegiate sports, and I wish and I hope that your story gets disseminated so that the kids are there now who have much more opportunities. I had better opportunities than you guys did 4 or 5 years later, but here we're looking 40 or 50 years later, and the opportunities are limitless to include NIL, getting paid, et cetera, et cetera. So, but you guys got to be very, very proud of the precedent that you set for all of us that followed.
Right. Let's move on to the Georgia Tech coach that recruited Eddie and Joe and took a shot at you, Charlie. Bud Carson. People don't. I have to admit, I didn't even realize it. I started thinking, who was the coach at Georgia Tech? Bud Carson is mostly known for his NFL days, coached Super Bowl teams with the Steelers and the Rams. And the thing that gets overlooked in this Bear Bryant myth about 1970 is coaches with less job security than Bear Bryant were sticking out their necks in the 60s. Bill Tate at Wake Forest, Ralph Shook Jordan at Auburn, Charlie Bradshaw at Kentucky, Doug Dickey at Tennessee, Bill Yeoman at Houston, Hayden Fry at Southern Methodist, and Bud Carson deserves to be mentioned in that same group for what he was doing in the Deep South at Georgia Tech.
I really didn't figure out why that he only got that 1 or 2 years at Georgia Tech, but the alumni is kind of up in the air about some of the movements he was making, and the next thing we knew, boom, Bud was gone. You know.
Yeah, well, we're gonna let Bud Carson's wife give us a little insight on that. Bud was 9-3 his
Yeah,
first year, including a bowl victory. Great
yeah,
season at Georgia Tech.
yeah,
Next year they go 6-6. 500 seasons don't get coaches fired after a good season, but it
yeah.
got Bud Carson fired. And
Yeah.
here's what Bud's wife said about it years later.
1968 was a tough time racially for our country, the South, and the city of Atlanta. It was also when Linda's husband, Bud Carson, was the head football coach at Georgia Tech. And Bud is responsible for bringing the first young black man to play quarterback at Georgia Tech. So a news anchor from Atlanta, from Channel 11, posted a great story on Facebook this week about that quarterback named Eddie McCashin and about Bud. So Linda, I loved learning how Bud really broke through racial boundaries by wanting Eddie McCashin as his quarterback. What do you remember about this time?
Oh, I will never forget it. I was the anchor at Atlanta Alive at Channel 11 in Atlanta, and Jeff Hullinger, who just interviewed Eddie McShann 50 years later, wrote this article, put it on TV, and oh my goodness, the memories it brings back. This was just before Bud and I met and started dating.
Okay.
So when most women lie in bed with their husbands, they hear how wonderful they are. When Bud and I were together, he told me how wonderful Eddie McShann had been. He never got over this. Eddie McShann was one of the top 3 quarterbacks in the nation from Gainesville, Florida. Was really hard to get into Georgia Tech. You had to have really high academics, and you had to be able to continue that and major in engineering. Eddie wanted to come to Georgia Tech. Bud brought him into Georgia Tech. He was the first black scholarship player at Georgia Tech. There'd been one black player there before, but he played on defense, so he was not the top guy.
Right.
Eddie came in, there was a lot of controversy about it. Bud made sure he had somebody watching over him. One of his staff members introduced him to the black community, so he had friends, and just made sure that he was safe, and he was as good as Bud thought he was going to be. He was brilliant. He was a freshman. The quarterback that was starting, his father and grandfather had played at Georgia Tech, and in one of the biggest games of the season, he started playing badly on national TV. Bud took him out and put in freshman black player Eddie McShann, and he was brilliant. And then Bud played the freshman over the senior several more times because he was the best player.
Right.
Well, the father of the senior quarterback came up to Bud and said, "This will cost you your job. You will be fired for this." And he was. And then Bud, of course, went on to the NFL, and everything turned out really well. The next coach that came in did not want to bother with Eddie, so he set him on the bench. Eddie finally went on to another school, got injured, and that was the end of his football
But
career.
this brought some racial tension to Georgia Tech.
Oh, my goodness.
I read that when the next coach came in and pulled Eddie, like the NCAA came in, like there were protests. The black community realized you're sitting him because he's black, and that was not okay.
Well, he had his tires slashed. Poor Eddie. It was horrible for him. He had his windows broken out. He had death threats. And I think of Eddie today, and he lost his football career. But then I think, okay, but somebody had to be the first one to walk through that door. Often the first person that walks through the door does face a really hard time. But he opened that door for a lot of other football players and doctors and dentists.
Right.
And for Bud, he's been dead almost 15 years now, and he just had a little great grandson born, and this will be the one thing that grandson, I promise you, the great grandson will know about
I love
Bud.
that.
How proud we are. And I said to Bud, "Didn't you know you were taking a risk that might have bad results?" And he said, "Every day I walk on the football field, I know I'm taking a risk that
Right.
would have bad results." You got to do the right thing without thinking about the consequences.
And play the best player.
Both of those guys did the right thing, and here 50 years later, we're still talking about it.
Which is
So,
amazing.
Eddie, I love you. I've heard about you all of my life.
Oh, that is great. And I love that an Atlanta news anchor wanted to bring that story back and talk about it because we learned something new great about Bud.
Thank you, Jeff.
So,
Thank you
yeah,
so
really
much.
neat. I was just thrilled to read it.
Well, Bud Carson and the things that you guys say about him really brings back a parallel to my experience playing quarterback for Coffee High School in Florence, Alabama. Tom was writing a story on me and about me and Coach K, who we mentioned earlier. He and I met while I was at West Point, and he went back and talked to Coach Buddy Moore, who ended up being Major General Buddy Moore after a while. He was in the National Guard and actually was the Adjutant General later for the state of Alabama. And he got a little pressure, and I didn't even know about it until I read Tom's interview with him for starting me at quarterback in 1973. I played some in 72. I was a safety rover, but took over as full-time starting quarterback my senior year. And the idea of a coach is what really the world and business is about, right? A meritocracy, where we pick people to do things who are best to do it. Now, I don't want to get into politics and all the things that we're going through right now, because that process is being used against some segments of society. However, on the athletic field, people want to do what? They want to win. So as a result of that, good coaches are going to stand up to the pressure that they get to put a winning product on the field. And I think that's what Bud Carson obviously did.
Yeah.
And that's what Buddy Moore did as well for me in high school.
Okay, and then 1970 was actually a pretty transformative year. A lot of things were happening in Atlanta. We've already talked about Eddie starting as the Deep South's first black quarterback, but 1970 was also the year that Muhammad Ali made his comeback, and Atlanta agreed to let him fight when he
Yeah.
was banned from boxing, and he fought Jerry Quarry on October 26, 1970. Eddie was on the cover of Jet magazine in October 1970. And then the 1970 baseball season would have ended. The Atlanta Braves were still relatively new to Atlanta. I think they came there in 66. But the 1970 baseball season would have ended. Hank Aaron hit 38 home runs. That gave him a total of 592. So now you started talking about Babe Ruth 714 being within range of Hank Aaron to break, which of course he did 4 years later. So a lot of things were going on in Atlanta, and a lot of things that we need to remember in our history. I want to transition.
Back in the day, Eddie, it was actually his last game, senior, and there was some tickets that were supposed to be for his family, and didn't happen. When we played in the Liberty Bowl, matter of fact, I still got the Liberty Bowl ring, 1972, and Eddie was, kind of disciplined by our coach that we had.
The coach who succeeded Bud Carson.
Yeah, the coach that succeeded Bud Carson.
Fulcher.
Yeah, Fulcher.
Coach Fulcher. Yeah. And Coach Fulcher, he suspended him and wouldn't let him play in the game, So, Jesse came in, Jesse Jackson, Herman Russell, all of the big bigs in Atlanta came in to support him, and tried to, see if they could get him back on track.
Yeah, let's talk about the golden era at E. Smith. It was one of only 5 black high schools that remained open after desegregation, and a lot of athletes came out of that school.
Yeah.
Jimmy Ray, of course, was a pioneer, the South's first black quarterback to win a national title at Michigan State in the 65 and 66 seasons. You guys were growing up in Fayetteville when he was breaking ground, and Charlie, the Baggett family, lived right next door to the Ray family. And in addition to you guys, Doug Wilkerson, who went on to a long NFL career, he had
Yeah.
originally planned to go to Michigan State. Bishop
Yeah.
Harris was a longtime NFL assistant coach. Talk about that era and the role models that you guys had.
Well, I can start first, Joe.
Mm.
We grew up playing midget league ball, as they call it at that time, and then we played junior high school ball starting in the 7th grade through the 9th, where they have middle school now. And we ended up at E. Smith in senior high school playing ball. And Joe and I were fortunate enough to always be on the varsity teams. And I don't know if it was fortunate or not because we were playing against some good guys. But we watched the guys at E. Smith that went before us, Doug and Jimmy and all those guys, and call names on top of names, that
Right.
that came out of E. Smith and also out of our conference because we played an all-black conference. Herm, I don't believe you said yours was integrated. Was your conference?
Yes.
Mm,
Yeah, it was integrated.
Yeah. Well, we didn't integrate until Joe and I's 10th grade.
mm,
We were all segregated in the 7th through the 9th grade, and when we got to high school, we only had very few white kids going to E. Smith with us, and they were bused in from Fort Bragg, which was right beside Fayetteville, and they were Army rats, as they were called. And so it was a new day for us in that respect. But sports-wise, our coaches that we had were phenomenal. They were futuristic. They gave us an opportunity to win. In fact, when we first played the white high school in town, all white high school in town, the first year, Joe and I were in the 10th grade, and they black running back, happened to be one of the only black kids at the white school, and they ended up beating us 29-0. And then the next 2 years, Joe and I said, we ain't gonna let this happen anymore. And beating them our junior and senior year, and they said it was the largest crowds in the history of Fayetteville sports. And that remains one of the biggest memories that I have of playing high school football, aside from another game that we lost against a guy who ended up playing at East Carolina, but he was on the Wilson Fight team that beat us in the semifinals, Joe and I. But we just had a tremendous childhood. Growing up, everybody was so loving. We had one park that we could go to. We couldn't go to the white recreation parks, and so we were so tight and so competitive against each other that it made us that much better. And so we enjoyed our childhood, and we kept improving and getting better at what we were doing, and the rest is history.
Well, Tom, I'd like to ask Joe, with all the coaching experience that you had, how did you use your experience from high school and somewhat segregated? And you've been at several, Bowling Green, Michigan State. Obviously, you were on a recruiting trail. How did that experience help you become a better recruiter?
Sorry.
What was that for me?
Yes.
Oh, it did tremendously. In fact, at the beginning, Herm, I didn't want to be a college coach. I didn't want to be a coach at all. And Jimmy talked me into it. I started out at IBM for 1 year, and I could see why they're the best corporation in the world, because I went to their training school in New York. And you're talking about something stressful and strenuous. I mean, they do a tremendous job, as you probably know, Herm, that when you're in the corporate world, that they train you if you're going. After 1 year, I said, this is not for me. And I called Jimmy and I said, I don't want to do this. And he said, well, you ought to think about coaching. And my college coach had gotten a job at Bowling Green at that time, Denny Stoles. And his secretary, Mary Kay, called me one day and said, Denny's got an opening. He wants you to come and coach for him. But that's the way I got in here. But it did help me going through those things that I went through to be a better recruiter. And I'd even come down here to Atlanta recruiting sometime, and Joe would help me.
In 2013, Willie Taggart was the coach at South Florida, and they've traveled up to Michigan State to play. And I talked to him before the game, and wrote a story. And he said he would tell his kids about how this was hallowed ground, that so many integration pioneering moments happened at Michigan State, talking about Jimmy Ray and Duffy Doherty and his teams with Bubba Smith, George Webster. And he talked about it being hallowed ground. And one
Mhm.
game that should be included in that is Eddie McShann starting in 1972 with on the sidelines is Duffy Doherty, the most important coach in college football integration. And Jimmy Ray is in his first year as an assistant coach. Charlie Baggett is having to sit out as a transfer, but
Mhm.
he's in the stadium. And some guy named Tyrone Willingham is there too, as a walk-on with you there, Charlie. And
Yes.
then Joe Harris is on the field having to take on blocks from Billy Joe Dupree, the All-American tight end.
Yeah.
This is really a monumental game that should have a place in college football history. Eddie, on the first series of the game, threw a 77-yard touchdown pass, and then later he threw a 36-yard touchdown pass. And Georgia Tech upset Michigan State 21-16. Michigan State had a lot of talent on that team. They had 11 All Big Ten honorees and 10 get drafted. What they didn't have was a quarterback. And that must have just been eating at Charlie watching the game on the sidelines. They had a guy named George Mihal be the quarterback. Eddie was 16 for 26, 2 touchdowns, 1 interception. George was 8 for 22, 0 touchdowns, 3 interceptions, and he had 48 yards lost rushing. And for the season, Michigan State only averaged 14.2 points a game. The defense only gave up 14 points a game. And I'm sure most of those touchdowns were set up by turnovers and bad field position. Um, Talk about what you remember about that game and what it meant for all of you guys to be on the field that day.
Go ahead, Joe. You were playing.
Hey, I know what it meant to me. It felt like you could drop a pin and you wouldn't hear it. You wouldn't hear a thing. I mean, it was so quiet. It looks like it had at least 90,000 people in that stadium. I don't know how many it was, but they were just so quiet the whole game. And you wouldn't hear much until someone made a play, then they go, oh, whatever. But, being playing safety that game out of position, but it was almost like a perfect game for me because they were doing the wishbone or whatever offense that was. They were running a lot. So I'm a great tackler. So what do? I stop them, and it was unbelievable for us to play again and to come out of that type of success and win that game, because we were like David and Goliath. And that's the way we looked at it, Everybody do your job, focus on what you do, and we'll win this thing. And that's what we did,
Yeah,
It
and,
was,
excuse me for the coughing there. Joe, you had, I think, what, 14, 17 tackles?
Yes,
And
sir.
let's also mention that you still have the career record for total tackles at Georgia Tech, correct?
Yes.
Go ahead, Charlie. Talk about you, Jimmy, and Tyrone watching this unfold.
Yeah.
well, it was another one of those memories that you'll never forget because it was my first game watching the game in Spartan Stadium. I had just gotten on campus because I transferred from North Carolina. I just got in school at Michigan State one day before it was the last day you could enroll because we were on the quarters at Michigan State, and in North Carolina we were on the semesters. So we had started school back in August in North Carolina, and I got my transcript, and Jimmy called me and said, I'll get everything set up for you and get you up here. So it was a special moment for me to see Joe on the field and and to watch the game with Tyrone, because he was a freshman at that time. We're sitting in the stands together, and it's a game that I'll never forget, and especially with Eddie being the quarterback at that particular time, and my best friend Joe being on the Georgia Tech team. So it was very special. It's one of those moments that we talk about, and you'll always remember for the rest of your life.
Yeah, and Duffy, I was already starting to ponder retirement because the team hadn't been playing well. The athletic budget had been cut, football budget, but they opened up with a real good win over Illinois, and he got his spirits back up. And then when they lost to Georgia Tech, he didn't announce it publicly, but he realized then that he needed to retire. And Billy Joe Dupree told me this. It's in my book, Ray of Light. That he called Brad Van Pelt and him and said, "I'm going to retire at the end of the season." And then George Mihal just had another disastrous game, and the Spartans lost 51-6 at USC, the eventual national champion. Eventually, Mark Neeson, a wishbone quarterback in high school, was switched from safety to play quarterback. But it leaves the unanswered question: what if Charlie Baggett had been the quarterback that year? Might have been a different season because you had a lot of talent on that team, Charlie.
Yeah,
Yeah.
a lot of and Joe played against it, and I saw it every day in practice. And of course, all those guys got drafted: Delano Lear, Billy Joe Dupree,
Yeah.
Brad Field, just on and on. We had great players, but
Was Mike Hope on that team? Mike Hope?
Mike was on that team also. Yes,
Yeah.
Flea Allen, they had some players. So yeah.
Well, the final
Sure.
comment is almost the same as the first comment. You gentlemen are trailblazers, you're leaders, you're the foundation of not only Black high school players, but all high school players. And what is even more important is how you've taken what you've learned and you've taken it to a new place. Certainly, Charlie, with you developing, you named some of the more famous players that you've coached. However, I would be one of those unsung ones out there. And I'm certain a lot of those guys, because let me tell you how we had to do, those of us that played on the scout team. We didn't have the talent, but we had to try harder. And that is what gave us the perseverance to come out here in the civilian world and do great things. And Joe, thank you for, and I'm going to try to get a copy of your book, for taking those memories and putting them to paper. And I'm going to actually look for it. Hopefully I can find it on Amazon, because I do want to read, because again, I was right behind you and getting an upfront picture today that I've gotten of you. So both of you gentlemen, thank you very much for being the leaders that you are. And let's make sure that your story gets out there, and all these young men and women now can take advantage of this great opportunity to live, learn, and play while they're in college to make a great foundation.
Thank you, Herman.
Okay. Thank you, Herman. And Joe's book is The Stars That Never Shine: The Making of a Super Bowl Player.